John Parker had always dreamed of living in the Wild West. It wasn't just the idea of adventure that pulled him to this untamed land, but the sense of freedom. The freedom to live on his terms, to work the land and carve out a life from the earth. His past back east was filled with memories that were hard to forget. He had been married once, a long time ago, but that chapter had ended in sorrow when his wife passed away from illness. Left alone, he had wandered for a while, looking for a place where he could escape the pain of his memories. After years of searching, he found himself on the edge of the frontier, where the land was wild, untouched, and full of possibilities. John's farm wasn't much, but it was his. It sat alone in a wide stretch of open land, far away from the nearest town. There were no neighbors close by, no family and no friends, just John and the land. The silence that surrounded him could be overwhelming, but it was a silence that had become a part of him, something he'd learned to live with over the years. Days on the farm were long and exhausting, filled with hard work. John woke up early in the morning just as the first rays of sunlight began to break over the horizon. He spent his days plowing the fields, planting crops, and taking care of his animals. It was a simple life, but it kept him busy, which was exactly what he needed. The physical labor gave him something to focus on, something that didn't remind him of the empty house he lived in, or the years of loss that had shaped him. However, even though the work was constant, the loneliness was hard to ignore. The land was beautiful, yes, but it was also isolating. The only company John had was the sound of the wind rustling through the tall grass, the calls of birds overhead, and the occasional passing storm that would roll in from the mountains. Sometimes he would catch sight of a deer or a coyote in the distance, but that was about it. There were no other souls for miles. At first, the loneliness had been bearable. In fact, John had even welcomed it. It gave him space to think, to reflect, and to work through the sorrow that still lingered in his heart. But over time, the solitude began to feel like a heavy weight. He missed the sounds of human voices, the companionship of friends and family. The closest town was nearly a full day's ride away, and while he could occasionally head there for supplies, the journey was long and tiring. Most of the time, he preferred to stay home where things were quiet and predictable. As the seasons passed, John's routine stayed the same. He worked the fields during the day and went to bed early, exhausted from the labor. His nights were often spent staring at the flickering light of his campfire, lost in his thoughts. There were no visitors, no neighbors to share stories with, and no one to ask how his day had been. He would fall asleep to the sound of his own breathing, his own heartbeat, and the distant cries of animals in the wild. John's life was simple, but it was also empty. He had no one to share his successes with when the crops grew well or when the animals were healthy. And when things went wrong, when a storm destroyed part of his crops or an animal fell ill, there was no one there to offer help or comfort. He dealt with everything on his own, as he always had. Sometimes he thought about leaving. Maybe he should go back east, where the land was more settled, and where he could find people to talk to. But the thought of returning to the place where his past lived felt like stepping backward. He couldn't do it. Something about the Wild West kept him grounded. It was raw, untamed, and full of potential. He wasn't ready to leave. But even though he had chosen this life of solitude, John still wondered if there was more out there for him. There were stories that came from the far reaches of the frontier, tales of cowboys, outlaws, and settlers who had built communities in the middle of nowhere. It was a harsh life, no doubt, but it was also one filled with possibility. John had heard whispers of towns growing in places he had never seen, of communities being formed where people lived together, helping each other through the tough times. Maybe there was a place for him in one of those towns. Maybe there was something waiting for him out there. But those thoughts were just dreams. He knew the reality of the frontier was harsh. It wasn't the kind of place where a man could just show up and expect to find friendship. People had to earn their place in the Wild West, and that took time and effort. John had always been the solitary type, and he had gotten used to living alone. But the loneliness was starting to wear on him. One evening, as the sun dipped below, the horizon and the stars began to twinkle in the sky. John sat outside, gazing at the endless stretch of land before him. The wind whispered through the trees and the air was cool against his skin. He felt a deep sense of peace in the quiet, but there was also a longing for something more. He wanted connection. He wanted someone to share his life with, someone who understood the struggles of living on the frontier, someone who wouldn't turn away when things got tough. But that was a distant dream, one that seemed impossible. The Wild West wasn't a place for easy connections. People came and went, always moving, always chasing something. And for a man like John, who had left so much behind, it seemed that finding a place to belong would be just as difficult as it had been before. Despite the loneliness, John continued with his work. He planted his crops, cared for his animals, and kept the farm running. But every once in a while he would pause and look out across the land, wondering if there was someone else out there, someone who was searching for the same thing, a sense of belonging, a place to call home. He didn't know it yet, but his life was about to change in ways he couldn't have imagined. The adventure he had longed for, the connection he had craved, was closer than he thought, and it would come in a way he never expected. As time went on, John began to feel the weight of the world on his shoulders. His life on the farm was a constant cycle of hard work and silence. But in the back of his mind, he was always aware of the world beyond his small homestead. The Wild West was a place of great beauty, but also of great conflict. Tensions between the settlers and the Native American tribes had been growing for years, and John had heard enough whispers to understand that things were starting to escalate. The Apache, in particular, were a tribe that had long resisted the encroachment of settlers on their land. John didn't know much about the Apache, but he had heard stories of their fierce warriors and their fight to protect their way of life. It seemed like every month there were rumors of more battles, more raids, and more bloodshed. People in nearby towns talked about it in hushed voices, fearful of the Apache retaliation that could come at any moment. The army had been sent to patrol the land, pushing deeper into Apache territory, and more settlers had arrived, eager to claim land and build a life in the West. But none of this seemed to touch John directly. His farm was far from the nearest town, and he rarely ventured into town himself. It wasn't that he was indifferent. It was just that he had enough on his plate. He had his own worries, his crops, his animals, his solitude. The larger conflicts seemed like distant concerns that didn't affect him. Or so he thought. Then, one afternoon, everything changed. John had just finished repairing a section of his fence when he heard the sound of horses approaching. He didn't think much of it at first, assuming it was a passing traveler or maybe some ranchers from the nearby area. But as the dust cleared and the riders came into view, John's heart skipped a beat. The group was not a typical set of cowboys or ranchers. They were soldiers, mounted and carrying the unmistakable gear of the U.S. Army. The soldiers stopped just short of John's farm, and one of them, an officer, dismounted and approached him. "Pardon me?" "Sir," the officer said, his voice firm but respectful. "We're looking for a group of Apache who were spotted nearby. Have you seen anything unusual around here?" John felt a rush of tension build inside him. He had heard the rumors, but he had never seen any Apache himself. He thought about the stories, the raids, the attacks, and he wasn't sure what to say. "I've seen nothing," John replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Just my work here." The officer nodded, but John could tell that the soldier didn't believe him. He could see the tension in the soldier's eyes, the way his hand rested on the hilt of his rifle. The officer glanced back at the other soldiers, then turned back to John. "We'll keep an eye out, but stay alert," the officer said. "There's a lot of unrest in these parts. Keep your gates locked, and if you see anything strange, don't hesitate to report it." John nodded, feeling a chill run down his spine. The soldiers mounted their horses and rode off, disappearing into the distance. For a moment everything felt still, the only sound the soft rustling of the wind in the trees. But John couldn't shake the feeling that something big was coming. Days passed and John tried to continue with his work, but his mind kept drifting back to the soldiers and their warning. He thought about the Apache. What did they look like?
What were they like?
He had always heard of them in stories, but had never seen one in person. What would he do if they came near his farm? What if the conflict between the settlers and the Apache came closer to his home? He wasn't used to thinking about these things. His world had always been small, centered around his farm and the long days of labor that filled his time. But now it seemed like everything was changing. The Apache weren't just stories or rumors anymore. They were real people, and they were out there somewhere in the wilderness trying to protect what they had left. A few days later, John's unease was confirmed. As he was walking back to his cabin after a long day's work, he noticed smoke rising in the distance. It wasn't the usual kind of smoke from a campfire, but the thick black kind that signified something more. His heart pounded as he rushed toward the smoke, his boots kicking up dirt as he made his way across the land. When he reached the source of the smoke, he found a scene that shook him to his core. A group of Apache warriors had been captured by the soldiers. The Apache had fought hard, but they were outnumbered and the army had quickly overpowered them. John stood at the edge of the scene watching as the soldiers rounded up the prisoners. Among them, one figure stood out. A young Apache woman, her face hard and defiant, her posture proud despite the chains that held her. John's heart twisted as he watched her. There was something about her that caught his attention. She wasn't like the others. While the others looked exhausted and broken, this woman still held her head high. Her eyes were fierce, like she was daring anyone to underestimate her. John couldn't take his eyes off her, and for a moment he forgot about the soldiers and the chaos around him. He was transfixed by her presence, her strength. The soldiers didn't seem to care about the individual stories of the captured Apache. They treated them like prisoners, like livestock, rounding them up and preparing them for transport. But John knew something wasn't right. These weren't just criminals or outlaws, they were people, forced to defend their land. And he wondered what had driven this woman to fight so fiercely. As the soldiers began to march the Apache prisoners back toward town, John stood frozen in place. He couldn't just turn away. The woman's defiance, her strength haunted him. She was the last of her people, it seemed. What would happen to her? What would happen to them all? Later that night, John couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in his bed, unable to shake the image of the Apache woman from his mind. Her eyes, full of fire and sorrow, kept flashing before him. He had seen so many things in his life, but nothing had impacted him the way she had. It was then that John realized something. The Wild West wasn't just a place of freedom and opportunity. It was a place of suffering, too. He had always known that, but it hadn't really hit him until now. He wasn't just living in isolation. He was living on land that had been taken from others. And though he had come here to escape his past, it seemed that the past had found him again. The Apache weren't just distant enemies. They were human beings caught in a struggle for survival. John didn't know what he could do about it, but he knew that he couldn't just stand by and watch. Days passed since the encounter with the soldiers, and John couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled in his chest. He went back to his daily routine, tending to his crops, caring for his animals, and mending fences. But his mind kept wandering back to that moment when he had seen the Apache prisoners. More specifically, his thoughts always returned to the young Apache woman who had looked at him with such fierce defiance. She had stood out from the rest of the group, her posture upright, her gaze burning with a sense of pride even in the face of captivity. John tried to push these thoughts aside. His life was simple, and he didn't need to get involved in the struggles of others. The world of soldiers, prisoners, and wars seemed far removed from his quiet farm life. But the image of that woman haunted him, and he found it harder to ignore as the days went on. She wasn't just another face in the crowd of prisoners. She had made an impression on him, and he couldn't quite explain why. One morning, as John worked outside, a group of soldiers rode past his farm. At first, he didn't think much of it. Just another patrol, probably on their way to check the area for any signs of Apache activity. But as they rode closer, he saw something that made his heart race. They were escorting a small group of people, and among them was the same Apache woman. She walked with her head held high, her eyes straight ahead, unflinching despite the guards surrounding her. John's breath caught in his throat. There was something about her that made him feel as though there was more at play here than just the usual conflict. He watched from a distance as the soldiers led the prisoners toward the town, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. As the soldiers disappeared into the distance, John felt a stirring in his chest. He didn't know what to do with this feeling. He wasn't a man who sought out trouble. He had spent most of his life keeping to himself, working his farm and staying away from conflicts. But for some reason, he couldn't let go of the thought of that woman. Later that evening, after a long day of work, John found himself staring at the flickering firelight in his cabin, deep in thought. The idea of the young Apache woman being sold just like any other prisoner disturbed him. He knew that the government had been rounding up Native Americans and selling them as prisoners or laborers, but he had never imagined he would see it firsthand. And yet that was exactly what he had witnessed. His mind raced with questions. What had happened to her people? Why was she the last one left? He had heard stories about the Apache, about their fierce resistance to outsiders, but he didn't know the full story. All he knew was that the woman he had seen seemed different from the others. She was more than just a prisoner. She was a symbol of something greater, the end of an era, the fading of a culture, and the destruction of a way of life. The more he thought about it, the more he felt compelled to act. But what could he do? He wasn't a soldier and he wasn't a man of power. His farm was his whole world and he had no business interfering in something so complex. Yet the nagging feeling that he couldn't simply ignore what he had seen grew stronger. The next day, as John worked in the fields, he found himself constantly looking up, as though expecting to see the Apache woman again. It was ridiculous, of course. He had no idea where she had gone after the soldiers took her. But the image of her walking among the prisoners, her eyes filled with pride and defiance, stayed with him. By mid-morning, a familiar sight caught his attention. It was the same group of soldiers, but this time they were traveling with a wagon, and there was no sign of the Apache woman among them. John felt a pang of disappointment. Had she been sold already? The thought made him uneasy. He felt an overwhelming sense of helplessness. He had no idea what had happened to her, but he couldn't shake the feeling that her story wasn't over yet. Later that afternoon, John ventured into the nearby town to pick up some supplies. He had avoided going to town as much as possible, but today he felt like he needed to get out to clear his head. As he walked down the dusty main street, he overheard snippets of conversation from people gathered at the general store. They were talking about the recent capture of the Apache, the soldiers' patrols, and the fate of the prisoners. John tried not to pay too much attention, but one conversation caught his ear. Two men were speaking in low voices, discussing the auction that would take place in a few days. John's curiosity was piqued. An auction? What kind of auction? That Apache woman, one man said, his voice low. She's the last one. I hear they're going to sell her soon, like they did with the others. The whole town's going to show up for the bidding. John's heart skipped a beat. The Apache woman, the last of her people. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. She was going to be sold? Like cattle? The thought made his stomach turn. He couldn't stand by and let it happen. He didn't know how or why, but he felt an overwhelming sense of responsibility. There was no way he could let this woman be sold off like property. That evening, after returning to his farm, John found himself pacing back and forth. The more he thought about it, the more determined he became. He didn't know what the right thing to do was, but he couldn't sit back and pretend it wasn't his problem. This wasn't just about an auction. It was about a person, an individual who deserved more than to be treated as an object. He didn't know why, but something inside him told him that helping her was the right thing to do. The next day, John made up his mind. He would go to the auction. He didn't have much money. His farm barely provided enough to cover his needs, but he would find a way. He couldn't stand the thought of the Apache woman being sold, and he was willing to do whatever it took to help her. As he prepared to leave, John felt a strange sense of urgency. It was as though the fate of this woman had somehow become tied to his own. There was no turning back now. He had made up his mind, and he was going to do whatever it took to ensure that she wouldn't just become another piece of property in a world that treated people like things to be bought and sold. The morning of the auction arrived faster than John had anticipated. He awoke early, the sun barely rising over the horizon. His mind was already racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. He had spent the entire night thinking about the Apache woman and what he was about to do. There was no turning back now. He had made up his mind. He wasn't sure what exactly he would do once he arrived at the auction. But he couldn't stand by and let the woman be treated like property. John prepared himself quietly, gathering what little money he had saved over the months. His pockets weren't full, but he had enough to make an offer. He had no idea how much she might sell for, but he couldn't let the price stop him. If he had to, he would work off whatever he owed her, though the idea of that made him uncomfortable. His only goal was to stop her from being sold into a life that would only treat her as less than human. He saddled his horse and rode the long distance into town, his heart beating with a mix of fear and determination. He knew the people in town would be gathered for the event, curious, eager, maybe even excited to buy a prisoner, as if it were a normal transaction. But to John it was nothing but wrong. There was no way to ignore the injustice of it all, and he wasn't sure what he was going to do once he got there. He just knew that he couldn't let the woman be sold. The small town was bustling with activity as John rode in. People were gathering in the open square, some standing in groups, talking excitedly about the auction, while others were moving toward the wooden platform where the prisoners would be displayed for sale. John felt an uncomfortable knot in his stomach as he dismounted from his horse and joined the crowd. He stayed in the back, trying to blend in, though his presence was no secret. Some people recognized him from the local general store, but most were too distracted by the event to pay him much attention. He glanced around, scanning the crowd. His heart sank when he saw the Apache woman, standing off to the side, surrounded by soldiers. She was still defiant, her posture straight, though she looked weary from the long days of captivity. Her eyes scanned the crowd, her gaze cold and distant as if she were trying to shut out the world around her. John couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pity for her. She didn't deserve to be here, to be treated like a piece of property. John watched as the auctioneer climbed up onto the platform. The crowd quieted, their eyes turning to the man who was about to sell human beings as though they were no more valuable than livestock. John's stomach churned as the auctioneer began his speech, listing the details of the prisoners and their origins, as if their lives could be reduced to mere facts and figures. He introduced the Apache woman last, and when her name was spoken, John could see the crowd's interest peak. She was the last of her people, the last Apache woman left in the area. There was a certain air of mystery surrounding her, and John could tell that some in the crowd saw her as an exotic prize, a rarity that they could own. The auctioneer turned to her, motioning for the soldiers to bring her forward. The Apache woman stood still, her face expressionless as the crowd's eyes were fixed on her. The auctioneer started the bidding, and John's heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea what to expect. He didn't know what kind of price would be put on her, but he knew that the moment she was sold, she would lose any freedom she had left. A man at the front of the crowd raised his hand, his voice booming as he made the first bid. It wasn't an outrageous amount, but it was enough to get the bidding started. Other hands followed. John's stomach tightened as the price went up with each new bid. The woman stood there silent, her eyes locked forward as though she were somewhere else, somewhere far away from this place. John didn't hesitate. He raised his hand, his voice low as he made his own bid. The auctioneer paused, surprised to see someone in the back of the crowd joining in. John's hand was trembling, but he didn't care. He kept his eyes on the Apache woman, trying to communicate something with just a look. He didn't know if she could see him, or if she even cared, but in that moment John felt that he had to do something. Even if it seemed impossible, the bidding went back and forth, each man raising his hand trying to outbid the other. John's heart raced as he kept his hand raised. He didn't know if he could win, but he couldn't stop now. The money he had was all he could afford, and if that wasn't enough, he would find another way. He couldn't let her go to someone else, not when he had the chance to stop it. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the auctioneer raised his gavel and called for silence. The bidding had stopped, and John's heart pounded in his chest as the final price was announced. He had won. The Apache woman was his. John's mind was in a whirlwind. He had done it. He had actually bought her. The thought didn't feel real. As the soldiers moved to release her, she took a slow step forward, still keeping her head high. Her eyes finally met his, and for a moment time seemed to stop. There was a flicker of recognition in her gaze, though it was hard to read. John wasn't sure what to expect from her, but he knew he couldn't back down now. He had to do what he promised himself. He had to help her, no matter what that might mean. The soldiers handed her over to John without a word, and he led her away from the auction. As they walked, John didn't know what to say. There was so much he wanted to ask her, but he knew it would take time for her to trust him, to speak to him. She was still processing everything. Being sold, the loss of her people, the uncertainty of her future. The silence between them was heavy, but it was not an uncomfortable one. John felt as though they were both carrying the weight of a history that had led them here. He didn't know what was going to happen next or how he could truly help her, but he promised himself one thing. He would never treat her as an object. She was a person, a human being, and he would make sure she was treated with dignity no matter what. As they left the crowd behind and walked back toward his farm, John knew that things would never be the same. His life had changed in ways he hadn't expected. The Wild West, with its dangers and challenges, had brought them together. Now he wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing for certain: he wouldn't face it alone. The days that followed the auction felt like a blur to John. It was as though the world had shifted beneath his feet, and he was now walking on unfamiliar ground. The woman, Tala, he had learned her name, was no longer a stranger to him, but he could sense the distance between them. She was quiet, distant, and still very much the prisoner she had been sold as. Though she no longer wore chains, there was an invisible barrier between them, a space that both of them seemed afraid to cross. John tried not to push her too hard. He knew she had been through a lot. Being captured, held in captivity, and then sold like a piece of property. No one could imagine the pain and humiliation she must have felt. The weight of what she had gone through was not something that could be easily forgotten, even if John wanted to help. She had been a warrior, a protector of her people, and now she was alone in a world that was strange and unfriendly to her. The first few days were awkward. John would try to speak to her, but Tala would only nod or shake her head. She didn't seem interested in talking, and John didn't want to push her. Instead, he focused on the farm, keeping busy with his usual tasks. But his thoughts were often with her, wondering how she was coping, if she was hungry, if she was cold at night. He was starting to realize just how little he knew about what she needed, about how to care for someone who had been through so much. He didn't know her language, and she didn't seem willing to share anything with him, not yet. One evening, as John was working in the barn, he heard the soft sound of footsteps behind him. He turned and saw Tala standing in the doorway. She was watching him, her dark eyes studying him carefully. "Do you need something?" John asked, trying to sound casual. He was always afraid that he might say something wrong or make her feel uncomfortable. Tala didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped closer, still keeping her distance. Her expression was unreadable, and John wasn't sure what to make of it. She pointed at the firewood stacked nearby, then at her hands. It took John a moment to understand, but when he did, he felt a wave of guilt wash over him. She wanted to help, but her hands were still bound by the traditions of the past. She hadn't been raised to just sit around. "I see," he said quietly. "You want to help with the chores?" Tala nodded, her eyes searching his face for a reaction. John hesitated. He hadn't expected her to offer help, and part of him wondered if he was doing the right thing by letting her work. But at the same time, he realized that she had always been a part of something bigger. She had belonged to a community, to a way of life where everyone worked together, and now here she was on her own in a strange place with no family, no tribe, nothing familiar to cling to. "All right," John said, a sense of determination settling in him. "We'll start with the firewood." From that moment on, things began to change. Tala began to open up, not with words, but through actions. She worked alongside John, helping him with whatever needed to be done. At first, it was just the basic chores: gathering wood, feeding the animals, cleaning the barn. But slowly, the gap between them started to narrow. Tala showed him how to make the fire burn hotter and longer, how to handle the animals more gently, and how to listen to the land in ways that John hadn't known before. She was teaching him things, not with words, but with quiet gestures and steady, sure movements. Still, their connection remained mostly unspoken. Tala rarely spoke, but when she did, her voice was soft, her words measured. Over time, John began to pick up on the way she communicated, through her eyes, her posture, and the small things she did. She wasn't as distant as she had been at first. In fact, John started to see glimpses of the woman who had been a warrior, a leader. There was fire in her, even though she tried to hide it. It was there in the way she carried herself, in the way she could hold her ground without saying a word. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, John sat outside his cabin, watching the sky turn from orange to purple. He had been working harder than usual, trying to catch up on some of the tasks that had been left undone while he focused on helping Tala adjust. He was exhausted, but there was a sense of satisfaction in the work he had done. The farm was beginning to feel more like home again, and for the first time in years he didn't feel so alone. Tala sat beside him, silent as always. John didn't mind the silence. It was comfortable even. "You know," John said after a long pause, "I never expected things to turn out this way." Tala turned to look at him, her expression unreadable, but her eyes searching his face as if waiting for him to say more. John wasn't sure why he felt the need to explain himself, but the words came anyway. I wasn't looking for anyone to share my life with. I came out here to be alone, he continued, his voice quiet. But something about this place, this land, it changes you. I don't know how to explain it, but you become part of it. And maybe you become part of something else too. Tala didn't respond right away, but John felt a shift in the air. It was as though she understood what he was saying, even if she didn't speak. They sat there for a long time, watching the stars come out one by one. It was a peaceful moment, one that neither of them had expected but both needed. The next few weeks passed in a blur of activity. John and Tala continued working together on the farm, and slowly they began to fall into a rhythm. John started teaching her English, though it was difficult at first. Tala had her own way of communicating, and it took time for her to adjust to the new language. But little by little, they began to understand each other more. John's heart began to open in ways he hadn't thought possible. He had never expected to care for someone again, not after everything he had been through. But with Tala there was something different. She wasn't just a woman he had bought. She was a person with a past, a story, and a future. And together, they were writing a new chapter, one that neither of them had expected. It wasn't always easy. There were moments of tension when they didn't understand each other, when old wounds resurfaced. But there was something about the life they were building together that kept them moving forward. They were both survivors, both people who had lost something along the way, but in each other, they had found something worth holding on to. As the months passed, the farm began to thrive. The crops grew tall and healthy, the animals were well fed, and John had the sense that he was building something that mattered again. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was living, and he wasn't doing it alone. Tala, too, had begun to change. She had found a new sense of purpose, not just in the work she did, but in the quiet connection she shared with John. She was no longer just the last of her people. She was a part of something, a part of a future that was uncertain but filled with possibilities. Together, John and Tala had found a way forward, carving out a life in the vast, untamed land of the Wild West. It wasn't the life either of them had planned, but it was one they could share. And in the end, that was all that mattered.